Racist cop arrests black woman but freezes when he sees her diplomatic passport. What would you do if you were stopped by the police just walking down the street and accused of something you didn't do simply because of how you looked? Now, imagine that officer doesn't believe you when you try to explain yourself, but there's one thing he doesn't know about you, something that's about to change everything. What happens when the person you least expect to be in trouble turns out to be someone with the power to make that officer's life crumble? This is the story of how one woman's calm resolve in the face of injustice forced a corrupt system to its knees. Stay tuned to hear what happens when a racist cop tries to arrest the wrong person and why it's a mistake he'll never recover from. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of evening that felt peaceful, almost tranquil, with the sound of rustling leaves and the distant hum of an ice cream truck weaving through the streets. For Rebecca Monroe, this quiet serenity felt like the perfect ending to a long, grueling day. She had just finished an important meeting with a colleague at a small cafe a few blocks away. The conversation had been productive, yet draining. Her mind buzzed with the weight of the diplomatic discussions, the future plans she had laid out, and the sheer responsibility that rested on her shoulders. Rebecca, dressed in a sharp blazer and comfortable slacks, walked briskly down the sidewalk towards her car. She adjusted her bag over her shoulder, feeling the smooth leather under her fingers. Her heels clicked lightly against the pavement, each step deliberate, a reflection of the strength she carried within. Despite the long day, Rebecca had a sense of calm about her, a calm that only someone used to the pressure of high-stakes environments could possess. She was used to being in control, used to handling difficult situations with grace and composure. As she walked, she felt the cool breeze of the evening brushing against her face. Her thoughts drifted to the next step in her career, her goals, and the people she would soon be meeting again. She was a diplomat, after all, used to navigating the complexities of international relations and representing her country's interests abroad. But there, in the quiet of her neighborhood, she was just a woman enjoying a peaceful walk. She had earned this moment, and she planned to savor it. But as Rebecca approached the intersection where her car was parked, she noticed something that immediately pulled her out of her thoughts. A police car, parked along the curb a few meters ahead, caught her attention. It wasn't the car itself that drew her gaze, but the officer who sat inside. Officer Jake Harris, a man known in the neighborhood for his imposing presence and stern demeanor, had been a fixture in the area for years. His reputation, though not widely known, was something many of the residents had quietly discussed behind closed doors. There were whispers of his tendency to profile people, to stop them for no real reason other than their appearance. And now, Rebecca was about to become the next subject of his suspicion. At first, she tried to ignore the car, assuming it was just routine patrol. But as she got closer, she noticed Harris's eyes following her every move. She felt a brief flicker of unease, though she quickly brushed it aside. She was a confident, educated woman. She had nothing to fear from a police officer. Then, as if on cue, Harris shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He turned on the flashing lights, the sudden noise of the siren breaking the otherwise serene evening air. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation. Was there a reason for the stop? Was she breaking some kind of law that she hadn't noticed? The streets were quiet, the neighborhood peaceful. There was no reason for an officer to pull over anyone, especially not her. But before she could even process what was happening, Harris had already opened his car door and was stepping out onto the sidewalk. His boots hit the pavement with authority as he slowly approached her. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold and calculating. "Excuse me, ma'am." Harris's voice was sharp, his tone clipped. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Rebecca's brow furrowed. "I'm just walking home," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just leaving the cafe down the street." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her, scrutinizing every inch of her. She shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his stare. "You know," Harris said after a long pause, his voice almost mocking, "this neighborhood's been seeing a lot of robberies recently, and you don't exactly look like you belong here." Rebecca's eyes widened in disbelief. The accusation hung in the air, thick with unwarranted hostility. She could feel her pulse quickening, the familiar sense of injustice creeping in. The implication was clear. He was stereotyping her, assuming that because of her appearance she was some sort of criminal. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, trying to stay calm, though she felt a knot tightening in her stomach. "I live here. I'm just walking home from a meeting, and I'm headed to my car." She motioned to the parked vehicle just a few yards away. Harris wasn't listening. He had already decided that Rebecca was a target, a person to be investigated, questioned, scrutinized. His mind had closed, and the label he had placed on her was now firmly fixed. He took a step closer, towering over her, his eyes narrowing further. "I'll need to see some ID." Rebecca hesitated, her mind racing. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the sudden, unjust accusation threw her off guard. She reached into her bag, slowly pulling out her wallet. But as she did, Harris seemed to grow more impatient, his hand resting firmly on the holster at his side. "I said, ID!" he barked, his voice rising. Rebecca's chest tightened. She could feel the heat rising in her face. She wasn't going to let this man treat her like a criminal. "I'm not some random person off the street," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm a diplomat. You can check my ID, but this is ridiculous." But Harris wasn't interested in hearing her explanation. He reached out and grabbed her arm, roughly pulling it toward him. "Stop resisting," he spat, a flash of aggression in his eyes. Rebecca's heart pounded. She didn't resist, but she couldn't keep quiet any longer. "You're making a mistake," she said, struggling to remain calm. "I've done nothing wrong. You can check my ID, my passport, anything, but don't treat me like this." Harris didn't listen. He was already placing the cuffs on her wrists, tightening them with a force that made her flinch. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Harris muttered, as though he were doing her a favor by arresting her. Rebecca stood there stunned as he shoved her toward the back of the squad car. The cuffs dug into her wrists, and she tried to keep her composure, but the injustice of the situation burned within her. She had done nothing wrong. She was being arrested for no reason other than the color of her skin. As she was about to be shoved into the back seat, something inside her clicked. She knew she had to do something, to say something that could change this moment. And so she took a deep breath, gathering herself before speaking. "Wait," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I have something in my bag you need to see. I'm not some random person. I'm a diplomat." Harris's response was dismissive, but Rebecca didn't back down. She reached into her bag, pulling out her diplomatic passport. The moment she held it up, she saw the slight hesitation in his eyes. Harris froze. The truth was about to come crashing down on him, and he knew it. Rebecca was no ordinary woman. The cool metal of the handcuffs pressed harshly against Rebecca's skin as she stood at the back of the squad car. The chill of the night air cut through her blazer, but it was nothing compared to the burning heat of indignation that rushed through her. For a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped moving. She was trapped in an unbearable stillness, her thoughts racing faster than her pulse. This was happening. She was being arrested, detained, like a criminal, for simply existing in this space, this moment, under the watchful eyes of a man who had already decided her fate, based solely on her appearance. Her chest rose and fell with every breath, but her mind was focused. Rebecca had learned long ago that there were moments in life when you couldn't simply let things happen to you. You had to take control. And she knew now more than ever that this was one of those moments. Rebecca was a woman of conviction, raised in a household that had instilled in her the belief that she could overcome any obstacle as long as she stayed true to herself. But this was different. She had never imagined in all her years of education, in all the sophisticated meetings she had attended, that she would find herself at the mercy of a police officer who wasn't listening, who had already dismissed her. As Harris fumbled with the cuffs, preparing to force her into the back of the patrol car, Rebecca reached into her bag, her fingers steady despite the tense situation. She had to end this before it spiraled even further. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the air, steady and clear. The words came from somewhere deep within her, an instinct, a quiet command. "I have something in my bag. You need to see it." Harris paused. His hand was still on the cuffs, but something about her tone made him stop. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his body language stiff with suspicion. He didn't seem to expect her to speak up, especially not with such composure. His grip on the cuffs tightened. "I said, stop resisting," he barked, his voice rising, a reaction born from his own insecurity. He was losing control, and it irritated him. His assumptions about her were now being questioned. His authority was slipping away. Rebecca wasn't fazed. She had lived her life in high-stakes environments, navigating power dynamics, presenting facts to politicians and diplomats, staying calm under pressure. This moment was no different. "I'm not resisting," she replied calmly, locking eyes with him, "but I want you to understand who I am. I'm a diplomat, and I'm asking you to let me show you my credentials. You need to see my passport. I am who I say I am." Harris's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing across his face. He stepped back slightly, his posture shifting, but still his fingers hovered near the cuffs. His gaze flickered down to her bag, where the gleam of a dark leather wallet lay within easy reach. For a split second, there was a hesitation in the air. Something unspoken passed between them, and Rebecca noticed it. She saw it in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, a fleeting recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a mistake. But that brief hesitation was enough for her to take the next step. Slowly she pulled the leather wallet from her bag, her fingers cool against the smooth material, despite the simmering tension around them. She took a deep breath and, with deliberate care, opened it. Harris didn't move. The usual cocky swagger he carried with him was now replaced with uncertainty, his rigid stance betraying him. His eyes followed the motion of her hands as she retrieved a slim, official-looking passport. She held it out for him to see, the gold-embossed emblem of her diplomatic status glinting in the waning sunlight. The insignia of the United Nations. It was undeniable. And in that moment Rebecca knew it would change everything. "Here," she said, her voice steady. "You'll see that I am a diplomat. I'm not just a woman in this neighborhood for no reason. I'm here on official business." Harris hesitated, his gaze flickering between her calm face and the passport in her hand. His breath caught, and for the first time since he had stopped her, a shift happened. The cocky edge to his stance faltered. He could no longer cling to the excuse of suspicion. His hand dropped from the cuffs, his lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. His eyes flitted from the passport back to Rebecca, a faint trace of panic creeping into his expression. The truth was sitting there, staring him in the face, undeniable and unyielding. This was a diplomatic passport. She was not just any citizen. She was a person of importance, an official with the full weight of international recognition behind her. His assumptions, his racist assumptions, had been completely wrong. For a split second, Harris looked lost, like a deer caught in headlights. The air between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of his realization. He was no longer dealing with just any person. He was standing in front of someone who could end his career with a single phone call. A diplomat, a person whose very presence here could have him facing consequences far beyond what he was prepared for. Rebecca watched him. His indecision was like a flickering candlelight, vulnerable and exposed. Her own emotions were controlled, like a calm river under a stormy sky. She knew that the moment he acknowledged her status, it would change everything. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Harris blinked rapidly, his fingers twitching slightly, as if he wanted to reach out, but was now unsure of what to do. His next words came out in a rush, almost mumbled, and they were tinged with something close to regret or fear. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't realize. But Rebecca wasn't interested in his apology. Not yet. She'd heard those words far too often. What mattered now was what happened next. She wasn't the kind of person who let things slide, especially not when her dignity had been trampled on in such a demeaning way. "I think you'll want to make a call," she said, her voice now colder, carrying the weight of authority. "You need to let someone know what just happened here." Harris shifted uncomfortably, but he was caught. He knew the moment had passed. The damage was done. The phone call was inevitable. Rebecca stood tall, the handcuffs still biting into her wrists, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't just a diplomat. She was a woman who knew the value of standing firm. She had been wronged, and now she would make sure that the consequences of that wrong fell squarely on the shoulders of the man who had dared to treat her like a criminal. She had no intention of letting this go. The sharp clink of the handcuffs seemed to echo in Rebecca's ears as she stood there, her pulse steady, though the world around her had started to spin. She was still processing what had just happened, how she had been stopped, detained, treated like a criminal, all because of a man's assumption based on her skin color. The unfairness of it stung, but she knew better than to let it show. Anger was a powerful emotion, but in that moment it would have been a distraction. The real power was in composure, in taking control of the situation, even when everything was stacked against her. As she stood on the curb, the sun now dipping lower behind the distant buildings, Harris fumbled with his phone, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't used to this feeling of vulnerability, of being caught in the act of something so wrong. He had spent years enforcing laws, issuing tickets and making arrests, but never before had his authority been challenged in such a profound way, and never before had he arrested someone who could make him pay for his mistake. Harris wasn't just a cop now. He was a man caught in the crosshairs of his own prejudice. The weight of it was heavy on his shoulders, his mind scrambling for a way out. But there was no easy escape. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This wasn't just another interaction with a person he could brush off. Rebecca Monroe was someone who could turn his world upside down with a single phone call. The ringing of his phone broke through his spiraling thoughts, and he answered it quickly, though his voice was strained. Yeah, this is Officer Harris," he muttered, still unsure of how to proceed. His words were unsteady, and Rebecca could hear the hesitation in his tone, the uncertainty of a man who realized the enormity of his error. On the other end of the line, the voice that answered was calm but firm. It was Rebecca's superior at the embassy. In that moment, everything changed. She could feel the shift in the air as Harris's posture slumped, the false confidence he had held moments ago now gone, replaced with a raw, palpable fear. "Officer Harris," the voice said with measured calmness, "I've just been informed of the situation. You've detained a diplomat from the United Nations. Do you understand the seriousness of this? Do you understand what you've done?" Rebecca listened closely, every word cutting through the tension in the air. Harris's response was almost inaudible. His earlier bravado was replaced by the stammering words of a man who realized he had stepped too far. "I am sorry," he muttered, but his apology was empty, just a weak attempt to salvage what was left of his pride. He could feel the heat rising to his face as he stood there, his back to Rebecca, avoiding her gaze. He was caught, and there was no going back now. The conversation continued, and Rebecca could hear her superior's tone shift to one of finality. "You will be contacting your commanding officer immediately. This is a serious breach, and I expect full accountability. Do not attempt to justify your actions any further." As Harris ended the call, he turned slowly to face Rebecca, his shoulders slumped and his eyes avoiding hers. There was no denying it now. The man who had arrested her, accused her without cause, was facing the consequences of his actions. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he reached for his keys, trying to regain some semblance of control. Rebecca remained silent, her expression calm but unyielding. She had done what was necessary. Now, it was time for the system to do the rest. The moments stretched on in silence as Harris unlocked the cuffs with a quiet click. The tightness around Rebecca's wrists finally eased, but the discomfort of the situation remained. He handed the cuffs to her, his voice low and apologetic. I apologize for this. I made a mistake. I didn't know who you were." Rebecca met his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. She said nothing at first. There was nothing to say. The apology, however weak, wasn't enough to erase the humiliation she had just experienced. The anger bubbled up inside her, but she contained it. She would let the system do its job. She would make sure he never forgot this. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "You don't get to apologize to me, Officer Harris. You can apologize to your superiors. You can apologize to the people who will hold you accountable for your actions. But your apology doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change how you made me feel." She paused, letting the words settle, watching as Harris shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting with the keys in his hand, still avoiding her eyes. Rebecca continued, her tone unwavering. "You will never know what it's like to be a black woman, to be treated like a criminal without cause, simply because of how you look. But now you'll have to live with the consequences of your ignorance. And believe me, they'll be hard to ignore." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and measured, her head held high. The night felt colder now, but she felt a sense of clarity washing over her. She wasn't just walking away from this encounter. She was walking towards something bigger, something that would bring change, something that would make sure no one was ever treated like this again. Hours passed, but the weight of the day lingered on Rebecca. When she arrived home, her mind kept replaying the events, the harshness of the interaction, the officer's initial disbelief, and the apology that came too late. She had dealt with racism before, dealt with assumptions based on her skin color, but never had it come in such a form. Never had she been physically detained, accused, humiliated in such a public way. She let herself into her apartment, the familiar smell of her coffee lingering in the air. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. There was work to be done, but first she needed to make sure this didn't end here. The phone rang just as she was about to type. She glanced at the caller ID. It was her superior from the embassy, calling again. "Rebecca, are you all right?" The voice on the other end was soft, concerned. "We're handling it. The chief of police is already aware of what happened. I've called for an internal investigation into Officer Harris's conduct. It's not just about you. It's about sending a message that this will not stand." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. Her superior's words were a balm to her frazzled nerves, but they couldn't undo what had been done. She didn't want to feel like a victim, and she didn't want anyone to feel sorry for her. What she wanted was justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had been wronged like this. "I'm fine," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "But I want this handled quickly. He needs to understand what it means to take away someone's dignity like that. And if there's anything I can do to make sure this is seen through, I'll do it." "Of course," came the reply. "We'll make sure he faces the consequences. This is just the beginning, Rebecca." And with that, she knew the wheels were already turning. Harris's fate had been sealed. He would pay for his actions, and Rebecca, she would ensure that this moment wouldn't be forgotten. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that people like him, who thought they could get away with racial profiling, would never be allowed to do so again. As Rebecca closed her laptop, she allowed herself a small, quiet moment of satisfaction. The battle had only just begun, but she was ready, and now she had the power to see it through. The night stretched on, but Rebecca could hardly sleep. She had grown accustomed to the weight of responsibility that came with her position, the constant expectation to carry the world's burdens on her shoulders. But this felt different. The events from earlier that evening lingered like a shadow, the memories of Officer Harris's arrest attempt swirling in her mind. His suspicion, his rash decision to treat her like a criminal, the oppressive silence that had fallen between them once he realized his mistake, all of it played on repeat, never quite letting her go. She lay still in her bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. The city was quiet, save for the distant hum of cars on the freeway and the occasional rustling of leaves from the trees outside her apartment. She had always prided herself on being able to keep her emotions in check, to control her reactions even when faced with the most difficult situations. But tonight, something felt different. The injustice of it all, the sheer audacity of Harris's actions, had cut deeper than she'd anticipated. Despite the internal storm brewing inside her, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. Not after everything she had worked for, not after everything her community had endured. This was bigger than her. It was about something far more important, about the systemic racism that was woven into the fabric of society, and about the people who turned a blind eye to it every day. Rebecca couldn't afford to be silent. At some point, she managed to fall into a restless sleep, but the hours felt heavy, and when the morning light crept through the blinds, it was as if she had barely closed her eyes. By the time Rebecca stepped out of her apartment and into the world again, the pace of the day had already begun to pick up. The streets were busy, people hurrying to their jobs, children laughing as they walked to school, the hum of life moving in rhythm around her. But today, it felt different. The air was charged, like there was a storm waiting to break. And in a way, there was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she walked to her car, and when she pulled it out, the name on the screen made her pause. It was the Chief of Police. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca answered the call. "Rebecca, good morning. I hope you're doing well after last night." The chief's voice came through, steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "I'm fine," Rebecca replied, keeping her tone measured. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "I want to know where we stand. I need to know what's being done." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. "We're taking this very seriously. The internal investigation is already underway. We're looking into Harris's previous conduct, as well as his interactions with the public. I've made it clear that this can't be swept under the rug. We'll be following through with this until it's fully resolved." Rebecca's grip tightened around the phone, the words from the chief hanging in the air. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to see it through. She had been through too much, fought too many battles, to let one more instance of injustice slide by. Harris had made a mistake, but the real question was whether the system would hold him accountable. "I appreciate that," Rebecca said, her voice cold and deliberate. "But I need more than just an investigation. I need to know that Harris will face the consequences of his actions. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been subjected to the same kind of treatment. It's about making sure he never does this again. I understand, and I assure you, we're doing everything in our power to ensure that accountability is reached. I've already informed the department that this will not be tolerated." Rebecca paused, taking in the chief's words. There was a sense of resolve in his voice, but there was also something else. Doubt. She knew how these situations worked. She had seen too many cases where the system failed to deliver true justice. This time, she wasn't going to let that happen. "I'll be expecting updates," she said, her tone unwavering, "and I'll be following closely. Harris won't get away with this." The chief didn't hesitate. "Of course, you'll be informed every step of the way." With that, she hung up, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on her shoulders. She had set things in motion, but now came the hardest part. Waiting. Waiting for the investigation to unfold, waiting for the truth to come to light. In the meantime, she couldn't afford to sit idly by. She had to make sure her voice was heard, that this wasn't just another incident to be forgotten with time. The next few days passed in a blur. Rebecca kept her head down at work, focusing on her diplomatic duties, but the weight of the situation never fully left her. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat. She was waiting for the next update, the next step in the process. And when it came, it wasn't what she expected. It was late one afternoon when Rebecca received the email. It was from the police department, but the tone was different. It wasn't an update on the investigation. It wasn't an apology. It was a formal statement. Officer Harris had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. The email also included a note from the chief, stating that appropriate action would be taken once the investigation was completed. Rebecca stared at the screen for several moments, the words sinking in. It wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. Administrative leave? That was standard protocol, but it wasn't justice. It wasn't accountability. Her hands shook slightly as she set the phone down on her desk. This wasn't what she had fought for. She had demanded change, not just a temporary solution that would allow Harris to return to his post once the dust settled. She had to take this further. She had to make sure that what had happened to her wasn't just brushed aside. That evening, Rebecca sat in her living room, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on her as she thought through her next steps. She couldn't rely solely on the department to make the right decisions. She had learned over the years that real change rarely came from the inside out. It had to be driven from the outside, from people who weren't afraid to shake the system awake. With a deep breath, Rebecca grabbed her laptop and began drafting a letter, one that would be sent to the public, to the media, to anyone who would listen. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced the same injustice, the same racial profiling, and had been silenced by the systems in place to protect the wrongdoers. The words poured from her fingers, her thoughts clearer than ever before. She spoke of the need for accountability, for systemic reform, and for the end of racial profiling in law enforcement. She spoke of her own experience not as a victim, but as someone who had fought back, someone who was determined to make sure this didn't happen again. By the time she finished the letter, it was well past midnight, but there was no time to waste. She sent it out, reaching out to journalists, activists, and organizations dedicated to fighting injustice. The world needed to know. And Harris needed to understand that his actions would have consequences far beyond this small, quiet neighborhood. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her heart racing with a sense of purpose. This was only the beginning. She knew that the fight ahead would be long, but she was ready. The storm was coming, and it wasn't going to stop until justice had been served. The next morning came with the bite of reality, and Rebecca felt the weight of the previous night's decisions settling into her bones. She had sent out her letter, not knowing exactly what would come of it, but feeling an undeniable certainty that it was the right thing to do. In the hours that followed, the floodgates had opened. Her email had been shared by journalists, activists, and people who had experienced similar mistreatment. What had begun as a personal ordeal was now a rallying cry for those who had long been ignored or silenced. The phone calls and messages came pouring in, some expressing solidarity, others seeking her comment on the story that was quickly picking up steam. By late morning, the story had made its way to local news outlets, and social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag #OurJusticeForRebecca Monroe began trending, and the calls for accountability grew louder. Rebecca, though somewhat overwhelmed, couldn't help but feel a sense of validation. Her voice, once just an echo in a crowded room, had become a beacon for others who had faced similar injustices. But with that validation came the harsh reality that she was now at the center of a storm. The media attention would only intensify. There would be no turning back. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the police department issued its own statement, vague and devoid of substance. The statement confirmed that Officer Harris had been placed on administrative leave, but it was clear from the wording that the department was hoping the public would move on. It was nothing more than a superficial attempt at damage control. Rebecca knew better. She had seen this dance before, the carefully crafted statements, the promises of investigations that often went nowhere. She couldn't rely on them to do what was right. If she wanted true justice, she would have to keep pushing. Hours later, as Rebecca sat at her desk, she received a call that made her heart skip a beat. It was from the chief of police again. This time his tone was different. There was no longer any semblance of confidence or authority. It was as if the chief knew that the walls were closing in on him, that the department's handling of the situation was slipping through their fingers. "Rebecca," the chief's voice crackled through the phone, "I want to be transparent with you. The pressure from the public, the media, it's building. We're under scrutiny. We've had people calling for your resignation, calling for changes to how we handle racial profiling in this department." Rebecca didn't need him to explain the obvious. The media frenzy, the public outcry, it was all a result of her letter. And it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about systemic change, about holding people accountable for the damage they caused with their actions. This wasn't just one man's mistake. It was a reflection of the deeper rot within the system that allowed people like Harris to operate unchecked. "I understand the pressure, Chief," Rebecca said, her voice steady but resolute. "But that's not my problem. Your department has failed time and time again to address racial profiling. It's not just Harris. It's the culture that allows people like him to think they can act with impunity. If you want this to go away, you need to do more than just placate the public with a statement." The chief paused on the other end, likely processing her words. For a brief moment, there was silence. We're working on it, Rebecca," he finally replied, his voice strained. "But you've got to understand, this is a long road. There are legal implications. There are people who have been in this department for decades. It's not going to change overnight." Rebecca could hear the frustration in his voice, but she wasn't moved. She had already accepted the reality that real change was never easy. It was never convenient. It required patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. "It won't change at all if you don't take action," Rebecca replied. "If you want to prove that you're serious, you need to do more than just suspend Harris. You need to start addressing the bigger issues, the ones that created him in the first place." There was another pause, longer this time, and Rebecca could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on the chief. "We'll begin reviewing other officers," he said, his voice resigned. "We'll look at policies, training. It's just not as simple as it sounds." Rebecca knew this conversation wasn't over. The real work was just beginning. And as long as she had the public's attention, she wasn't about to let the system brush this under the rug. She wasn't going to let Harris or anyone like him walk away unscathed. That evening, Rebecca found herself once again at her desk, reviewing the news coverage. She had become the face of a larger movement, a symbol of resistance against the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement. It was strange, seeing her own name in headlines, hearing her voice echo through the media, but she knew it wasn't about her. This wasn't her fight alone. This was for every person who had been wrongly accused, wrongly detained, or mistreated by a system designed to protect the powerful. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from an old friend, someone from her past, a fellow diplomat who now worked with a civil rights organization. The message was short, but the weight of it hit her hard. "We're standing with you. We'll do everything we can to amplify your message. This isn't just about Harris. It's about dismantling a system that thrives on injustice. Stay strong, Rebecca." Rebecca sat back in her chair, her fingers resting on the keyboard, the words still fresh in her mind. She wasn't just a diplomat anymore. She was an advocate, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The battle was far from over, but now it felt like she had the whole world behind her. She took a deep breath and began drafting her next letter this time. It would be to the public. She wasn't going to wait for things to change. She was going to make them change. The following days were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca's voice continued to dominate the media cycle, and every time she spoke, more people listened. The pressure on the police department intensified. Protests began to form outside the precinct, demanding that Harris be fired and that the department implement real change. News outlets began running stories on the systemic issues within law enforcement, shining a spotlight on the very practices that Rebecca had been speaking out against for years. It was a slow, painful process, but the seeds of change had been planted. The question wasn't whether Harris would be held accountable, it was when. And when the moment came, it would be a turning point, not just for Rebecca, but for the countless others who had been victimized by a system that had long failed them. Rebecca knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. The storm was far from over, but it was headed in the right direction, and with every passing moment Rebecca's resolve grew stronger. She would see this through. She would ensure that Harris and everyone like him would be held accountable, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on the police department continued to mount. The protests outside the precinct grew larger, with passionate demonstrators chanting for justice, their voices echoing off the walls of the city's government buildings. Rebecca had become the unofficial face of the movement, her name on the lips of activists, journalists, and citizens alike. She had sparked something that could no longer be ignored. Rebecca's phone buzzed constantly, with messages of support, requests for interviews, and updates on the progress of the ongoing investigation. The story had moved beyond her personal experience. It had become a battle for justice, for accountability, and for the dismantling of a broken system that allowed officers like Harris to exist without consequence. But as the public outcry grew louder, so did the resistance. There were whispers behind closed doors, rumors that the department would try to sweep the issue under the rug. Rebecca had heard it all, the promises of reform, the reassurances that everything would be handled, but she knew better than to trust those empty words. She had seen firsthand how the system worked when no one was paying attention. It was only when the spotlight was on that real change could be made. As the weeks wore on, Rebecca found herself becoming more and more entrenched in the fight. She spent long hours meeting with activists, drafting statements, and working with legal teams to ensure that the case didn't get lost in bureaucracy. She couldn't afford to take a back seat now, not when so many were depending on her to lead this charge. And then, one morning, the call came. It was the chief of police again. This time, his voice was strained, almost apologetic. "Rebecca, I need to speak with you," he said, his tone noticeably different from their previous conversations. "There's no easy way to say this, but the investigation has reached a conclusion. Officer Harris has been officially terminated from the force." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this moment, but hearing it out loud was still a shock. Harris had been fired. The system had finally come to terms with the truth of what he had done. It was a victory, a hard-won battle that had taken months of pressure, of sleepless nights, of unyielding persistence. But it wasn't just about Harris. It was about the message this sent, about the ripple effect that would be felt across the entire department. "I want to thank you for your patience throughout this process," the chief continued, "and I understand this doesn't erase what happened, but we're making changes, Rebecca. Real changes. This department is undergoing a thorough review of its policies, its training programs, and its approach to racial profiling. This isn't just about firing one officer, it's about making sure this never happens again." Rebecca exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had pushed for this moment, had fought for it tooth and nail, but now that it had come, she couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Was this the real change she had been fighting for, or was it just another superficial fix, another way to placate the public and move on? "Thank you for telling me," Rebecca said, her voice steady but tinged with a note of caution. "But I'll be watching. This is just one victory. The real work begins now." The chief hesitated for a moment before responding. "I understand, and I assure you, we're committed to doing better." The announcement of Harris's termination made headlines, but the aftermath was just as intense. The media, once skeptical, now turned their focus to the police department's broader issues. Reports came in from all over the country of other departments, grappling with similar allegations of racial profiling and misconduct. Rebecca's name appeared in nearly every article, her words quoted as a beacon of hope for those fighting against systemic injustice. But as the weeks turned into months, Rebecca began to feel the strain of the fight. The media attention had waned, the protests had subsided, and yet the battle was far from over. There was still work to be done, real work, deep work, the kind that required more than just headlines and sound bites. Rebecca kept pushing forward. She met with legislators, worked with advocacy groups, and spoke at rallies. She became a trusted voice in the movement, a leader who had turned her personal ordeal into a powerful platform for change. But with every victory came a new obstacle, a new challenge to overcome. One afternoon, Rebecca received a letter from the mayor's office. She was invited to attend a closed-door meeting regarding police reform. It was the kind of meeting she had been hoping for, a chance to sit down with the decision-makers, the people who held the power to make real changes. It was a sign that her fight was being recognized, that the work she had done was starting to move the needle. She arrived at City Hall, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been mistreated, every officer who had abused their power, and every community that had suffered because of it. The meeting was long, the discussions intense. The mayor spoke about the need for new training programs, about community policing, about holding officers accountable. But it was clear that there were still those in the room who weren't fully committed to the changes Rebecca was pushing for. She saw the hesitation in their eyes, the reluctance to truly address the root of the problem. After hours of discussion, Rebecca stood up, her voice cutting through the room with the same clarity and conviction that had brought her this far. "I'm grateful for the progress that's been made," she said, her tone unwavering, "but we can't just scratch the surface. We can't keep talking about reform without talking about the systemic issues that are ingrained in this system. We need real change, not just promises." There was a moment of silence in the room as everyone processed her words, and then slowly the mayor nodded. "We hear you, Rebecca," he said, his voice quieter than before. "And we will do more. We'll make the changes necessary. We'll start with the training, but we won't stop there." The months that followed were filled with the slow, deliberate process of reform. Changes were made to the police department's policies, new training programs were implemented, and officers were held accountable in ways they hadn't been before. But Rebecca knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. It would never be over. There would always be more work to do, more challenges to face, and more battles to win. As the years went on, Rebecca's influence continued to grow. She was recognized not just as a diplomat, but as a tireless advocate for justice. Her name was synonymous with the movement for police reform, and her voice became one of the loudest in the conversation about racial equity and systemic change. And though the fight was far from finished, Rebecca knew that the impact of her actions had already begun to change the course of history. She had stood up when it mattered, when the world was watching, and she had forced the system to acknowledge its flaws. She had sparked a movement that would not be silenced. The storm was still raging, but Rebecca was ready. She had faced the worst of what the system had to offer, and she had come out stronger. And with every step forward, she knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She was fighting for justice. As the dust settles and justice takes its course, one thing becomes clear. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes courage, persistence, and a willingness to stand up when it feels like the world is stacked against you. This story is just one of many where people fight for what's right, pushing for a system that holds those in power accountable. If you believe in justice and want to see more stories like this unfold, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join the movement for change. Together, we can make a difference one story at a time. Don't miss out on the next chapter. Subscribe now.